option, it will be devastating. I can tell you that. Devastating for North Korea. That's called the military option. North Korea is a situation that should have been handled 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and 5 years ago, and it could have been handled much more easily. You had various administrations, many administrations, which left me a mess. But I'll fix the mess. So we'll see what happens with North Korea.
The U.S. president there doubling down once again on past threats to obliterate the Hermit Kingdom should the U.S. or its allies be attacked. This comes the day after North Korea accused the U.S. of declaring war and threatened to shoot down American bombers inside or outside its airspace. Its military releasing a propaganda video to that effect. And the North appears to be boosting its military assets. U.S. defense officials say Pyongyang sent a small number of fighter jets, missiles, and fuel tanks to a base on its eastern coast. Now, the deployments picked up by satellites. Meanwhile, it seems the North is trying to better understand its enemy. The Washington Post is reporting that Pyongyang has been quietly trying to arrange talks with conservative and Republican-linked analysts in the United States because they want to understand the White House strategy. They're quite confused over Trump's strategy. This apparently began well before the threats got so nasty, but now it seems more pressing than ever. The newspaper also reports that the North is looking for a way to discuss being recognized as a nuclear power. One of the analysts approached by North Korean intermediaries is Bruce Klingner. He's a former CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea, and he is now with the Conservative Heritage Foundation think tank and comes to us now from CNN Washington. Bruce, it's always good to see you. Just wanted to ask you more about North Korean officials reaching out to you to apparently visit Pyongyang for meetings. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, there have been North Korean reaching out to U.S. officials or former officials or academics for some time. I participated in several conferences over the years. The last was in June in Europe, and I wrote an op-ed about the results of that. But I think given the change in administration, that they would probably be more likely to reach out to those that they feel represent the mainstream of American thinking, which right now is predominantly advocating the need for greater pressure on North Korea, as well as some that they perceive might have better access to the Trump administration than those that perhaps they were including in conferences in the past.
What do you make of this, though, North Korean officials, especially right now with President Trump continuing to make these threats against North Korea? What do you make of North Korean government officials reaching out to Americans to try to understand what Trump's strategy is, what his messaging really means?
Well, I think they're struggling to try to figure out what the policy is. Even those of us in Washington are confused sometimes. There's conflicting signals coming from the administration. When I talk to officials on the inside, I feel like there's a more of a coherent strategy than perhaps one can see just from the public messaging. So I think just as those of us in Washington sometimes are confused, you know, if you think how is the view from Tokyo or Seoul or certainly Pyongyang, it may appear even more confusing.
But the outreach doesn't have anything to do with North Korea wanting to negotiate with the United States, right? Because it seems like negotiating a freeze for the nuclear program in exchange for the U.S. stopping its military exercises, it seems like that is a non-starter for North Korea. So what do they want?
Right. In my meetings in June, they were very emphatic that denuclearization is totally off the table. There's nothing the U.S. or South Korea or Japan could offer that could induce them to abandon their nuclear arsenal. When we tried floating different ideas, they really became irritated and just said, stop. Accept us as a nuclear state, then we're either prepared to talk about a peace treaty or fight. In the sense of if the U.S. wants to bring an attack, then bring it. So they're trying to send the signal very clearly of that denuclearization is not on the table. Even a freeze for freeze, no tests in return for the U.S. abandoning or reducing its military exercise. They didn't even seem very interested in that, even though it was a North Korean proposal back in January 2015.
Do you interpret, though, in North Korea's outreach to American analysts that their concern has peaked?
Well, my last meeting was in June, but certainly since then we've had North Korea successful 2 ICBM tests and the hydrogen bomb tests. Even when I met with them, they seem more self-assured, cockier even than in previous meetings. And then the readout in the article today indicates that the most recent meetings we're seeing that as well.
But back to some of these North Korean officials reaching out to you. They wanted you to have meetings in Pyongyang for what?
Well, it wasn't really specified. It was just an offer of facilitating a trip if necessary or if I was interested. And I pointed out that since September 1st, there's the new State Department restrictions so that U.S. citizens shouldn't be going to North Korea except for government or humanitarian reasons. So I'm willing to meet outside of Pyongyang.
You know, I just spoke to Otto Warmbier's parents. He's the young college student who died after being held captive for over a year in North Korea. And they are calling on the United States to put North Korea on the state sponsors of terror list. What do you think about that? And also, you know, will there ever be direct consequences for North Korea for being responsible for his death?
Well, if you look at the legal requirements for putting North Korea back on the state sponsors of terrorism list, it certainly meets the legal requirements, even setting aside the issue of Mr. Warmbier. You know, the various things that support terrorist groups, doing things such as threatening 9/11 style attacks against U.S. theaters or theater growers, you know, intended to intimidate the U.S. population, assassination attempts against defectors in South Korea, you know, a number of things that fulfill the legal requirements. So certainly it should go back on. And as for consequences, really also the consequences for what the UN Commission of Inquiry has deemed to be crimes against humanity against its own citizens. It may require, though, the collapse of the regime before any real justice can occur.
It's always a pleasure to have you on, Bruce Klingner. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, as we were just mentioning, the parents of that American college student held in North Korea who later died say their son was brutally tortured, and they're now demanding that the U.S. government and North Korea add North Korea to the list of state-sponsored terrorists, as I was just saying. Otto Warmbier, who was 22 years old, died in June shortly after returning to the U.S. North Korea denies torturing him, but his parents say he suffered tremendous brain damage, and they have this message for the North Korean leader.
You're a coward, your father's a coward, and your grandfather's a coward. You are a terrorist, you live in fear. If you're in a room with 4 other people, you're worried who's going to kill you. I pity you.
I would say you took such a good person. And you'll have to pay for that one day.
My full interview with the Warmbiers is coming up next hour, and they also talk about the moments when they saw Otto Warmbier for the first time after he was released, and they said they almost didn't recognize his son, that he came back to the United States blind and deaf and pretty much on his deathbed. So more on that next hour. Stay tuned for that. Also, the U.S. State Department says while it holds North Korea accountable for Otto Warmbier's unjust imprisonment, it's not ready to label it a state sponsor of terror, and it is still reviewing the evidence. Time to take a short break. When we come back,